Okay, the last policy we're going to look at is zoning. So basically, what happens is, you have certain parts of your city used for different purposes, residential, manufacturing, and then different types of residential. So you have, dense residential, which is like apartment complex or high rises, and then less dense, which is, single family housing, detached housing. And so eventually, this kind of starts out maybe naturally, but then it gets codified with zoning ordinances where you're only allowed to build a certain type of housing. So, in the neighborhood I'm in right now, you're only allowed to build single family housing. You cannot build duplexes, triplexes, that sort of thing. In many areas, you can't even build what are called mother-in-law units, which are just like, a little like garage unit for someone else. And so this becomes very restrictive. And basically, what it does is it keeps the neighborhood having a similar character over time. It's the idea being we want to preserve whatever this is a suburban type area, or this is where the apartment complexes are. That's the goal. But really, the end result is it heavily restricts supply, especially in a city like LA. Really, really heavily caps. Basically, it caps how big a city can get. And when you have restricted supply, this is going to cause much higher prices. So this is kind of like the single biggest problem, or the single biggest reason for high housing costs in cities, is that you physically cannot build more housing. You can't build up. Basically, as the cities have said, you cannot build, you can't build up. Okay. Some of the additional reason is for health reasons, is that we want the manufacturing area, which is typically dirtier or polluting, away from where people live, and we kind of want enough light in areas. Okay. Now, modern zoning, as I said, is just super super restrictive. Okay. Over 50% of housing in many cities is zoned for only single family. I mean, that is an insane number, right? You think typically your view of a city is it's dense. What cities have said is like 50% of the city cannot be dense. All right. And as I said, it effectively caps the population. Let's look at the history of LA. Okay. So in 1921 is really when this movement starts. These urban planners that think they're so smart are like, hey, we're starting to think about, what cities should look like. And what we think is, okay, we're going to have, the apartment complexes kind of along, again, sorry about the construction. We're going to have the apartment complexes kind of along the main transportation arteries. And then kind of in the interior, we're going to have our single family. Then we're going to zone certain areas that will be where all the retail is. Okay. And there are some pushback from developers who are saying like, hey man, we actually want to build more. This is too restrictive. And so they are allowed to build some more. Then with the FHA coming in, so the FHA during the Great Depression rescues a bunch of people who can't pay their mortgages, and the government basically takes over the loans. All right, this is kind of in the redlining area. This is the redlining part of history, where they essentially prioritize the single family over the multi-unit housing. So people who are living in single family are much more likely to get the government bailout, to get the government taking over of the mortgage. So this is a subsidy for single family housing, which is traditionally, your non-immigrant, non-black areas of the city. So this is kind of where the redlining comes in, where it's like the redlining, which typically your immigrant areas, are the areas that don't get these preferential mortgages, or the preferential basically mortgage bailouts. Okay. Now, okay, 34 to 50s. Um, there's massive downzonings in LA where everything starts becoming reclassified to R1. What's R1? R1 is that single family detached housing. Okay. So neighborhoods kind of argue for this to kind of keep the character of the neighborhood constant. They don't want a lot of changeover. They want the neighborhood to look the same. Okay. Um, and as the city expands, all of it is single family. Right. This is the era of the automobile, so it is possible for people to start commuting from different places, and people essentially are demanding single family housing. This also has preferential treatment from the government still. So the government is much more likely to guarantee the mortgages on single family housing still. And so you have all your development taking place is of that single family variety. Now, in the 50s and 60s, LA runs out of land. Basically, it's developed outward. It's all single family. And then they say, okay, now we still have people who want to live here because it's LA. We've run out of land to build on, so the developers start to infill. They start to add kind of multifamily units. Or we're gonna demo the single family house, and we're gonna put like a duplex or a triplex, or we're gonna put like a duplex on top of the single family house. They start to do this. Now the homeowners say, heck no, we don't want this, and they start protesting this the infill of developers, and they capture city council after city council, they're blocking this sort of thing. They say, no, what this is R1 only, single family owning only. And so building multi-unit developments becomes incredibly, incredibly difficult. In addition, there's parking requirements. Okay, this is, LA is the city of the car. So now we're also going to require parking requirements, which again, further caps housing. Now, when I build a multi-family unit, I gotta reserve some of the area for parking. So now there's even less housing. Okay. Then we get Prop 13. What Prop 13 does is it effectively caps property taxes at the purchase price. So when you buy a house now in California, your property taxes are based on the purchase price rather than the value of the house. So, my grandma who bought her house in the 70s for, $100,000, she's paying property tax on $100,000, not what the house is worth now, which is a couple million. So what this does is now people don't want to move. All right. So I bought my house. I got this great property tax. Yeah, I'm making more money, and I could afford a better house, but I'm paying I'm got this sweet deal on the property tax. I'm never going to move. I mean, this is also for commercial real estate. My sister-in-law has a coffee shop, right? So my sister-in-law's coffee shop, she wanted basically she wanted to do some stuff at the coffee shop. The owner of the space didn't want to let her. Okay, so my brother, who's married to her, okay, he knows some very wealthy individuals. He's not wealthy. He's actually not doing great, but he knows some wealthy individuals. He said, I'll get my friends to just buy the property, and then they'll be the owners, and you can do whatever. The friends try to buy the property for $40 million. It's worth $40 million. So they try to. Sorry, it's windy over here. Let me close this. So they go to the owner and say, well, here's $40 million. Sell us this retail space. The property owner is like, no, why would I do that? Well, it's $40 million. You don't want $40 million? Wait, we'll pay you 45. We'll pay you 50, No. I bought this property for $2 million. I'm paying property tax on $2 million and collecting all this in rent. And I'm only paying taxes on the $2 million. There's no place I could put that $50 million that would give me a higher return than what I'm currently getting because my taxes are so low. And so that place doesn't get developed. I mean, this is a beautiful retail space in the middle of Huntington Beach. What it should look like is retail space in the bottom, housing on the top. That's what it should look like. It should be really utilized as a commercial / residential area. It's not, because the owner, again, is paying, because of Prop 13, is not paying the right amount of taxes. It's paying taxes on what it was bought for way back in the 50s or 60s, which was, $2 million. So what Prop 13 does is it reduces churn in the market. Now people are holding on to property much longer than they should be. There's no reason my grandma should be living in her house. She should be living in a much smaller house. She shouldn't be living in this 2-story house where she raised her kids. But why would she move? If she moves, she won't be able to afford the property tax. Okay, so we have all these things going on in California. We have R1 is entrenched. This sort of zoning. We got Prop 13, which stops people from moving. All right, now we get Prop U. And this limits the height of commercial developments. So if you drive around LA and you're like, why is LA so ugly? Why are all these strip malls like on the corners just so ugly? Well, because, the height's capped. So they actually can't build up because of Prop U. Then we get the environmental impact reports in 1987. So anytime I want to do a big building, a big multi-unit building, I got to pay for a bunch of environmental impact reports. And people who don't like buildings start to use these environmental reports as weapons. They start suing developers when they don't want a project to get done. They start suing them, or rival developers will sue other developers using these environmental laws to stop development. Okay. So all these developments are making it so it's impossible to build in LA. No supply. Guess what happens to housing prices or rental prices? They explode because more and more people are moving to LA, but we can't add housing. So the demand curve shifting out, but the supply curve can't move, the thing that adjusts is price. So the prices go up and up and up and up because of all these different laws and zoning. And we're left with our current situation where, you got to pay, almost $1 million to just buy like a 2 bedroom house from like the 50s anywhere in LA, and your rents are what your rents are as the result of all these different things, the main issue being zoning. Okay. Now in 2000, there is some liberalization of these laws, allowing zoning near transit, but still not that much. This shows you the housing permits. Here's LA. You can see almost no housing permits issued in this period. Keep in mind, LA's population is doubling and doubling and doubling. So if the demand is doubling, doubling, and doubling, the supply isn't, all that is going to prices. In fact, you can look at this and you can predict where the high price cities are going to be. I bet you Boston's expensive to live in. They're not building any housing. Okay. Let's see. I bet you San Francisco is expensive. They're not building any housing. Okay. Now, some of these where they're not building housing is because people are leaving, like St. Louis and Detroit. Again, I bet you New York is expensive. They're not building anything. So basically, if you have a growing population with no supply increase, that's where all your expensive housing is. Boston, LA, New York, San Francisco. Seattle has done a good job building multi-unit housing. And so actually rents have not grown as much as you would expect in Seattle. All right. San Diego, look at that. Another expensive place. All right. So here's our result. You want to build a multi-unit housing. There's no standardized process. There's no process where if I get this, I get that done. It's definitely going to get improved. I have all these hoops I have to jump through. Okay. There's no guarantee of success. I got to do this all before the construction even starts. So basically I got to pay for these environmental reports. I got to pay to make sure that I'm going to get the right permits and all that. This is all the stuff I got to do before I even start construction. Banks are not going to finance this. So basically our results are only really, really large companies are going to be the developers. So we're going to have a lack of competition. Okay. You're not going to have like mom and pop developers. There's just only going to be a few big companies that can afford to do development, that can afford to front those upfront costs. And really, who gets to build is going to be determined because you have all these laws and rules and all this instead of a standard process. It's really going to be determined by who has the connections, who knows the right people, who knows who to bribe. Big scandal going on in LA with Koreatown, where the city council, when it was bribed, that's the only way you get building done is by bribing or knowing somebody. All right. In this, when you're dealing with this, all these laws and all these people that can throw up roadblocks to building. End result is your new construction is super, super expensive. And therefore, if I'm building something, I'm not going to be building, I'm not going to be building your Kias. I'm going to be building Ferraris. So all your new construction is luxury housing. Why? It's the only way it can recoup my costs. I'm not going to be building low-income housing because, it cost me everything I got to build the housing. So of course I'm going to be building luxury housing. So what we're end up with, or the end result is we get very little new construction. What new construction we get is super expensive to build. So therefore it's of the luxury variety. To drive this home, here is the case study of one laundromat from San Francisco. This is in LA, but it's a similar story. Okay. So the developer, the person who owns this land, keep in mind it's the people who own the land. They own it. Theoretically, they should be able to do with it what they want. But the problem is you have all sorts of people who can influence. So the developer owns this land. He wants to tear down the laundromat and build a 75-unit apartment complex. All right, great. Expand the supply. That would lower housing costs, lower rent costs. Okay. He's got to pay for 4 studies just to get approval. One of the studies had to show that this wasn't a historic laundromat. Okay. He had to do 3 other studies to show that the shadows of his proposed building were not going to fall in certain places. Okay. Including one he had to prove that there's already a playground that it's shaded all times a day. So he had to prove that it's not going to get more shade. And it's not even open. It's not even open to it wasn't a public playground. It was a school's playground that was not even open when the time the shade would fall on it. Okay. So after 4 years and hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on these studies, the developer just gives up. And what are we left with? We're left with less housing. Okay. So our consequence of zoning overall is that, as cities lose population in the 20th century, as people move to the suburbs, this wasn't really a problem that our cities were heavily zoned. Okay. But as people return to the cities, we see we can't really accommodate this new demand to live in cities because of the zoning. Shaw and Moretti kind of show that the cost of these regulations, zoning, rent control, historic preservation, environmental impact, 36% of GDP from 1964 to 2009. So basically, we lost 36% of what we could have had if we just allowed people to live in cities, if we just allowed people to build housing. Now, note error by Brian Kaplan discovered an error in this paper showing that this is actually an underestimate. This number is actually probably closer to 60%, something like that. This is a huge problem. Okay. Just there's a fun alternative. So Houston is the only city without zoning. So it should be actually, if you want to know about LA, 74% of LA is zoned for single family housing. So 74% of the city, you can only build detached housing. Okay. Houston is the only city without any zoning. Now, there are other kind of laws in Houston that kind of mimic zoning. So this is kind of a straw man, but theoretically, Houston has no zoning. Okay. And so what happens though is Houston's able to build lots of housing as the population grows. And so it's incredibly affordable. So lots of these Texas cities, as they grow, they're able to add housing because they have much less stringent zoning requirements and other regulation requirements. So Dallas, San Antonio, Houston, even as those populations double or triple over the past decades, the housing costs haven't exploded because they're able to accommodate the people moving there. Now, without zoning, you do get some weird outcomes. So here are some funny pictures from Houston. You know, you get a zone de erotica right next to a apartment this retail space here. You get, a skyscraper right next to a low slung house. You get a roller coaster right next to a house. So you get some weird stuff, but you also get cheap housing. All right, that's the end of my various rants on zoning.